White initiates with a king's pawn opening, establishing central presence. This is a solid, accurate move maintaining equality. Black responds with the French defense, creating a solid pawn structure. An accurate move that keeps the dynamic balance. White advances the d-pawn, challenging the center and gaining a slight space advantage. Solid play. Black contests the center directly, reinforcing their pawn chain. An accurate response preserving equality. White develops a knight to a natural square, influencing the center. A solid move that maintains the position. The move the bishop to b4 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the knight to f6, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost, paving the way for the bishop to g5, significantly boosting piece coordination. Continuing with the pawn on the d-file takes on e4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the knight takes on e4, liquidating material and gaining active play. Unlocking the bishop to e7 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the bishop takes on f6, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. White pushes the e-pawn, gaining space and restricting black's pieces. Solid play, maintaining the advantage. Black counterattacks the center with a pawn push. Solid play, keeping the position complex. White probes with a pawn, questioning the bishop's position. A solid maneuver to maintain pressure. Black captures the knight, improving their pawn structure but losing development time. An accurate positional decision. White recaptures with the b-pawn, opening a file and strengthening the center. Solid play. Black centralizes the queen, aiming for active play. A solid move that prepares for future action. White activates the queen, creating threats and pressure. Solid, accurate play. The move the pawn to f6 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the knight to e7, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost. Afterwards, the queen takes on g7 executes a favorable trade, which enables the rook to g8 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the queen takes on h7, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the pawn on the c-file takes on d4 executes a favorable trade. This allows the knight to e2, guaranteeing long-term space control. White develops the knight, strengthening their central control. Solid play, consolidating the advantage. Black develops the knight, improving their piece coordination. A solid move maintaining the dynamic balance. The move the queen to g3 by white is a mistake. A superior alternative was the bishop to b5, exerting diagonal pressure to limit the opponent's space, paving the way for the queen to f7, significantly boosting piece coordination. Continuing with the bishop takes on c6 with check, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the pawn on the b-file takes on c6, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the pawn on the d-file takes on c5 executes a favorable trade. This allows the bishop to a6, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the queen to f7 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the pawn to c4, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the bishop to e2, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the queen to f7 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to a4 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the bishop to d7 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the pawn on the e-file takes on f6, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. White captures a pawn on the flank, increasing their spatial advantage. Solid play. Black repositions the knight to a more active central square. A solid defensive maneuver. White develops the bishop to an active attacking diagonal. Solid play, increasing pressure. Black recaptures in the center, opening lines. A solid pawn exchange. White recaptures with the knight, centralizing the piece. Solid play, maintaining the advantage. Black exchanges knights, simplifying the position slightly. A solid positional decision. White recaptures with the queen, centralizing the most powerful piece. Solid play. Black castles kingside, seeking king safety. A solid, standard defensive move. White castles kingside, mirroring black's safety move. Solid play. Black develops the knight, activating another piece. Solid coordination. White repositions the queen to a more active central square. Solid play, maintaining pressure. Black advances the central pawn, gaining space. Solid counterplay. The move the bishop to e3 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the rook to b1, activating the rook on an open file. Paving the way for the bishop to e6, significantly boosting piece coordination. Which enables the bishop to e3 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. Whereby the rook on the f-file to d8 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Unlocking the pawn to h3 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the bishop to c8, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal. Solid counterplay. The move the rook on the f-file to b1 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to f4, claiming key space in the center. Paving the way for the pawn to e4, significantly boosting piece coordination. Which enables the bishop to e2 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. Whereby the queen to f6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Unlocking the queen to e1 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the rook on the f-file to d8, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black exchanges bishops, simplifying the position. Solid decision. White recaptures with the c-pawn, strengthening the pawn structure. Solid play. Black activates the rook on the open file. Solid positional adjustment. The move the pawn to f4 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to d4, claiming key space in the center. Paving the way for the rook to e6, significantly boosting piece coordination. Which enables the pawn to f3 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. Whereby the rook on the f-file to e8 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Unlocking the rook on the f-file to e1 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to h6, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the queen to c7 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the pawn to e4, claiming key space in the center. Afterwards, the pawn on the d-file takes on e4, executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the rook takes on e4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. Whereby the pawn to f5 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Unlocking the queen to e7 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the rook to f3, guaranteeing long-term space control. White captures the pawn, strengthening their material and positional advantage. Solid play. Black exchanges rooks, simplifying but not alleviating the pressure. Solid exchange. White recaptures, maintaining a dominant position. Solid play. Black recaptures, maintaining piece activity. Solid play. White recaptures, centralizing the queen. Solid play. Black recaptures, challenging white's queen. Solid counterplay. White centralizes the rook on the d file. Solid play, maintaining pressure. Black repositions the king, seeking better safety. Solid defensive adjustment. The move the pawn to h3 by white is a mistake. A superior alternative was the bishop to d4, exerting diagonal pressure to limit the opponent's space, paving the way for the knight to c6, significantly boosting piece coordination. Next comes the rook to f1 with check, pushing the tactical tension to its limit, whereby the king to g6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the rook to f4 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to h5, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the knight to c6 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the king to e6, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the king to f1, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the king to d7 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the king to e2 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the rook to e7 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the rook to f1, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the bishop to f4 by white is a mistake. A superior alternative was the king to f2, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the king to e6, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the rook to b1 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the rook to e7 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the bishop to d4 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the king to f5, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the rook to e7 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the pawn to d4, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the bishop to d2, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the rook to e7 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the king to f2 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the rook to d7 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to c4, guaranteeing long-term space control. White places the bishop on a strong outpost, increasing pressure. Solid play. Black repositions the rook, creating defensive solidity. Solid play. The move the rook to f1 with check by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the king to f2, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the pawn to h5, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the rook to f1 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the king to g6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the king to e2 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the rook to f7, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the king to e6 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the king to g6, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the rook to f3, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the rook to f7 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This is reinforced by the rook to g3 with check, gaining a vital tempo with check, unlocking the king to f6 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the rook to e3, guaranteeing long-term space control. White checks with the rook, forcing the king's movement. Solid play. Black repositions the king again. Solid defensive play. White centralizes the king, activating a potentially dormant piece. Solid positional play. Black pushes a flank pawn, aiming to create counterplay. Solid, but risky. White activates the rook on the b file, improving its scope. Solid play. Black repositions the king, a solid but passive move. White moves the rook, increasing pressure on the opponent's position. Solid play. The move the pawn to d4 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the pawn on the b-file takes on c5, instantly capturing the target to simplify the board. Afterwards, the bishop takes on c5 executes a favorable trade, which enables the pawn to g5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the bishop to e3 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to h6 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the king to e2, guaranteeing long-term space control. White advances the c-pawn, controlling more central space. Solid play. Black captures the pawn, simplifying. Solid exchange. White develops the bishop, adding another attacking piece. Solid play. Black checks with the rook, a solid attempt to disrupt White's coordination. White centralizes the king, consolidating their strong position. Solid play. The move the rook to e7 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the rook to f5, activating the rook on an open file, paving the way for the pawn to g4, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the rook to f6 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the rook takes on c5, liquidating material and gaining active play, unlocking the king to f7 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the rook to d5, guaranteeing long-term space control. White captures the rook, winning material and securing a decisive advantage. Solid play. Black checks with the king, a solid but ultimately futile attempt. White centralizes the king, reinforcing their control. Solid play. The move the rook to e6 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the rook to f7, activating the rook on an open file, allowing the rook to d5 with check, forcing the enemy king to find safety, which enables the king to c8 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the rook to d6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the king to b7 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the bishop to g1, guaranteeing long-term space control. White moves the rook to a powerful attacking square. Solid play. Black advances the g-pawn, a solid attempt to create some space. White checks with the rook, forcing the king into a worse position. Solid play. Black repositions the king. Solid, but passive defense. White develops the bishop, adding a powerful attacking piece. Solid play. Black repositions the rook. Solid defensive maneuver. White captures the pawn, opening lines and solidifying the win. Solid play. Black recaptures, a solid move in a lost position. White captures the rook, decisively winning material. Solid play. Black checks with the rook, a solid but futile attempt. White centralizes the king, protecting all remaining pieces. Solid play.